Amen.
Well, good evening. We are, I'm really looking forward to this series, and specifically because of the way we've chosen to look at these issues. So we're going to be talking tonight a little bit about Nostradamus, and you know, it's interesting. Well, there's a lot of things interesting about him. First off, it's very interesting. It's very difficult sometimes to find reliable, intelligent discussion about Nostradamus that isn't saying that Obama is the Antichrist. You know, so you know, it took me a while to figure out exactly how to find the articles that I needed to get the appropriate research done. But more importantly, sometimes as Christians, we have this tendency to act a little scared about things that we're unsure about, you know, and what happens is we just kind of ignore them, and we feel sometimes even that I don't even want to read or think or do anything outside of kind of this Christian subculture that has been created. So, you know, if you really want, you could wake up to a Christian poster in front of your bed, step out of the bed and open a Christian book, and then walk in. No, I drink Christian coffee. There is such a thing. On your way out to get rid of the coffee taste, take a Christian breath mint. There's one of those too. And as you're going down the road, have a Christian Jesus riding a surfboard on your dashboard. You know, the whole, we can stay, only listen to Christian music, only read Christian books. And, you know, it's okay that all that stuff is out there. But it's not okay if that's all we're ever exposed to. And here's why. Paul, he's a pretty great guy, pretty famous guy in the Bible, right? Paul goes to this place called Mars Hill. And that's not the cafe over there. yeah, so different one. Though it's a great name because of what happens at Mars Hill. So Paul goes, and he's invited kind of to the smarty pants debate center in the middle of this really intelligent culture, right? So these people just sit around debating philosophy and all this really great stuff. He's invited to speak there. And when he goes there, it's in Acts chapter 17. I'm not going to read it to you because I want to spend plenty of time on our topic for the day. But Acts chapter 22, he quotes their pagan prophets to them to explain about the Bible, about Christianity, and really not Christianity at that point even, really. It was Judaism mixed with Christianity. And so he quotes from their pagan prophets, and you read that and you're like, oh, that's interesting. But here's what's an important thing to realize. He had to read those prophets, right? He had to not just read them, he had to have memorized them, right? And so it's important for us not to be scared of engaging in reading and understanding and coming to a clear understanding of things that aren't necessarily 1000% Christian at a Christian bookstore that you can pay with Christian gift cards. You know, it's okay, and not just okay. Paul says, you know, it gives him credibility, right? It gives him credibility that he doesn't just come in trying to argue his point from his side. He comes and argues his point from their side, right? And so that's important, and I just want you to feel the freedom of that. So you're here because of this guy, right? Tonight. Nostradamus. He was a pretty interesting guy. He lived in the 1500s. And the 1500s was a time very similar to our own. Right now in our society, it's pretty much universally accepted at this point that we are in a time of cultural transition. And there are huge things that are changing. I mean, the fact that you could have like a major business like the newspaper industry 50 years ago be the be-all, end-all, and now, today, be totally struggling because of the internet and Craigslist, basically, because we don't pay for classified ads anymore, right? We have massive changes happening in our culture, and that's the exact same thing that was happening in Nostradamus' time. This was the moment, during his teenage years, was when the Protestant Reformation happened. right? This was the time where there was a new world. Like for a long time they thought that they knew everywhere. And then the world was flat. And then all of a sudden, North America was in the way, right? And so all of a sudden, they get reports back from the colonies of wild stories and so very fundamental things about the way they understood their world and their culture were changing, were coming undone, and were having to be renegotiated. And so he lived in the 1500s in that time. And so in those kind of times, the church and spiritual things become very important to people. Because when you remove the things that are totally solid and all the way accepted, right, it makes us realize that we can't explain everything. Right? It makes us realize that there is something more than right now. Is something more than our knowledge. And so at that point, the same kind of thing, astrology and divination, I forgot the plague, the Black Plague was going on at the same time. So astrology and divination became very important in the Protestant Reformation, like I mentioned before. So Nostradamus began his work as a pharmacist and eventually got married and became a doctor, lost his first wife and children to the plague, most likely. Shortly after becoming a doctor. And then he has this idea. He says, I'm going to start writing almanacs, right? And I'm going to predict the weather and the tides, and it's going to be all this kind of lunar cycle. And I'm going to do this like yearly almanac, and then I'm also going to include a couple of predictions using astrology, because that was his kind of hobby at the time. So I'm going to put some predictions in there. And he published his first volume, and it was like a runaway bestseller hit immediately. And so, of course, he wrote another, right? And that's kind of how it works in the publishing industry even then. And so, not long after his first almanac was published, he began working on what came to be known as his quatrains. And quatrains are basically 4 rhymed verses, kind of like poetry. And so he began to work on these, and these are what everybody has come to know of him. And he says that in his words, his first quatrains, he burned because he was afraid world leaders would use them to grab power. So, there's that. Now, when he did these things, when he used a lot of sources, so there's a lot of apocalypses, apocalyptic prophecies that have been written throughout the ages, right? They begin really, some people have suggested that some cave drawings are forms of apocalyptic prophecy. So really, as soon as our brains were at a point where we could think about the future, people began composing these. And so he had a lot of those, including the book of Revelation, because he was a Jewish person that had been converted to Christianity. And so he was a Christian, so he had the book of Revelation there, and then he would use all of those things as well as astrology, and then he would use water gazing or staring at flames to help, as a form of meditation, to help him really sense sense whatever you sense when you're writing prophecy, right? So he writes and writes and writes and writes, and he gathers his first century of them, and century is just 100, right? So he takes 100 of these quatrains, so that's 400 lines, and he puts them together in a book. And he writes a very long, wordy introduction to the book. You'd think he was a preacher, as how much he wrote. But it was just this long, wordy introduction. And in it, though, he's talking to his son, who at that time was 5 months old. And he says in there that he wants to make the predictions a little murky, so that they can only be understood really after he's gone, because he is afraid of what people will do with them. Right? And that's an important statement for us to remember, okay? That he intentionally took his quatrains and made them what he's called murky, or he wrote it in French, so it'll be murky, right? And so he publishes this first century of quatrains. And when he publishes them, I mean, it's like he published Harry Potter. I mean, it is amazing hit. A huge, huge hit. And he eventually was taken into the court of Catherine de Medici, which is the wife of Henry II, as a seer in her court, because she had a lot of divination people and seers there. And so he was incredibly famous. He was famous in his own time. He got to right after he wrote that first book, the first set of centuries, right? He began to get these letters, and you know, when somebody is really famous, people save everything, right? And so we've got all kinds of crazy letters written to him. You know, somebody say, "I lost my keys. Could you tell me where my keys are?" and like, do you know when I'm going to die and how I'm going to die? So he gets these letters asking him to predict all those different things. So that's a little bit of background about this guy. Let's look at one of his quatrains, okay? We're going to look at, this is kind of a typical one, and then we're going to look at the famous ones. We're going to spend some time looking at 9/11 and Hitler, and really discover kind of how people understand those prophecies. Now remember, these prophecies are written in French. The first one is a guy who translated them from French to English, trying to preserve each word's integrity, and the rest of them, though, it was an even smarter guy, right? He translated them not only correct, but also preserving the rhyme structure in English. So that's going to be, I don't know, I just imagine that this guy spent an enormous amount of time doing that, and I appreciate it because I don't know French. So here's what it says. This is just the typical one. Venus Neptune will pursue the undertaking. You will be thoughtful. That's a masculine word. You will be thoughtful, trouble the opponents. A tumult in Adri, sitting near the Thames. The quarter noise wounds the night of the sleeping ones. Which is obvious. Now, so Venus, Neptune. All right, let's look at this. So basically, you look at this and you say Venus and Neptune, which is what you would think. Okay, he's an astrologer type of guy, right? So you've got Venus and you've got Neptune, but the verb here is singular, right? So the verb is singular, which means it should be taken as somebody's name or something's name, Venus, Neptune, right? Single deal, right? So, which makes it kind of difficult to understand because now we don't know anyone named Venus, Neptune, and so that's the issue with that first one. And so either this is the wrong verb, or it's Venus Neptune is something's name. So Venus Neptune will pursue the undertaking. So maybe there's somebody named Venus Neptune that if you go to them for a loan, will give it to you, right? They will take your loan, right? So next one, you will be thoughtful, trouble the opponent. Now the trouble here isn't really a verb. It's that there's something missing, right? There is possibly a verb missing from that. So you will be thoughtful and trouble the opponents. And trouble the opponents. Are you going to trouble the opponents, or are the opponents going to trouble you? It's not clear. Okay? Next one. A tumult, which is a trumpet blast, in Adri, a city near the Thames. Now, this is interesting. It's just interesting. Adri some people say it refers to Hadrian, which then they take Hadrian to mean Hitler. But this is kind of one of the ones that they'll say, okay, this might not be talking about Hitler. But the other ones are. All right? Anyway, so the Adri, and so here's the deal. There is a city near the Thames. So it appears that Adri is a city near the Thames, not a person, in a tumult. So there's going to be a trumpet blast in a city near the Thames. So there's not a city named Adri that we can find. So there's a loud trumpet blast in a city near the Thames. Now some people then talk about this as possibly the Blitz in World War II, or the Zeppelins in World War I, and even some people talk about this as prophesying the bombers over Baghdad. or not, right? And then last one, the quarter noise wounds the night of the sleeping ones. So basically, the quarter noise is kind of referring to the trumpet blast, and it wounds the night of the sleeping ones. And this one is a very clearly well done prophecy, because basically it's a loud night, a loud noise wakes somebody up in the middle of the night, and that has definitely happened. It's happened to me, as a matter of fact. Last night, because I've got children in my house, and yeah, all right. It's a cruel joke sometimes. All right, so all right. Well, now that's just an idea. So what you see here, though, and I mean to take this seriously, because there's a lot of people who seriously study Nostradamus, but you can see the trouble, right? The trouble is that it is murky, right? It is intentionally murky. There are words missing. It's not clear what words refer to, and there we go. So now let's look at Hitler. This is the most famous one about Hitler. It says, "They'll swim the rivers, fiercely famished roots. Most of the army shall range the Ister. In an iron cage will be drawn the grape. When Rhine's child shall Germany watch over." So, right there it says, they shall, the Ister, right there. See that Ister? Ister is supposed to be Hitler, all right? So this is where they get Hitler. Now, Ister is actually the name of the lower Danube River. So there is a part of the segment of that river that in Nostradamus' time was known as the Ister, right? But this is where, so they say Ister is like short for Hitler. And you can kind of see where it sounds similar, right? Ister and Hitler. And so, if you look at that, an iron cage will be drawn the grape. So, you know, you might think of, this is the idea that every time that Hitler kind of conquered, he did not retreat, right? Retreat was not his deal. So he took a place and he kept it. I mean, until it all fell, of course, right? So, then, the last one, and this is the difficulty, because of the way he structured this sentence, it's not really clear exactly how to translate this sentence. And so, it could read, "When a child of the Rhine shall keep watch over his brother." The Rhine is the Rhine River. "And when a child of the Rhine shall keep watch over his brother," or "when the German child watches the Rhine," or "when the German child will observe nothing." All of those could be the way you translate that last sentence. Now, here's what's interesting. Hitler was born near a river, but not the Rhine River. So a river on the other side of Germany, in a place called Braunau, something like that. So he was born near a river, kind of. And if you're thinking globally, that's really a river close to the Rhine River. So you might be able to see where this comes from. So all right. So that is the Hitler prophecy. Now let's look at 9/11. And I think this is the most interesting one. So at 45 degrees shall burn the sky. Fire to approach the new grand city thence. Instantly great scattered flames will rise when one shall seek the Norman's evidence. Garden of the world near the new city. In the pathway of cavernous mountains seized and plunged into a cauldron shall be. Forced to drink water that's sulfur poison. So, at 45 degrees, latitude is in degrees, right? And so, New York is at 41 degrees. Pretty close, right? Pretty close. So, fire to approach the new grand city thence, and you think New York is a grand city, right? So that makes a little sense. Instantly, great scattered flames will rise, and you know what it looked like, right? When they hit, right? It just scattered, and then flames came out, right? When one shall seek the Norman's evidence, I don't know what that's about. Garden of the world near the new city, and so there is a big open area in front of the World Trade Centers, right? Not necessarily a garden. There is a huge garden in New York City. The pathway of cavernous mountains, and so the people who take this one will say that that's if you were Nostradamus and you saw giant skyscrapers, right? They're kind of cavernous, and they're tall as mountains, right? Cavernous mountains, seized and plunged into a cauldron shelving. Now this is interesting because you know that underneath the World Trade Centers there was all kinds of stuff. And so when they fell, right, they actually descended into something, right, underneath. And then forced to drink water that's sulfur poison. That didn't happen. But you can see, like, we can take this and really, this can be, wow, maybe this was his prophecy, right? Maybe this was true. The problem really is that before this, before 9/11, it was interpreted to mean something else. It was to mean a tidal wave of water that was infected, biological warfare, all kinds of things like that. And so that's really, there's two main problems, right, with Nostradamus. The first one, it's clear. The first one, it's clear that it's very obtuse, right? It's very murky. It's very difficult to understand, right? There are words left out. There's pronoun reference difficulty. You can't just sit down and read his prophecies and say, ah, that makes sense, right? And then the other thing, and this is something that's difficult, is that nothing that Nostradamus predicted has ever been understood before it happened, right? No one has ever said, okay, here's what Nostradamus says here. Now, this predicts this event in the future, right? And then that happened. That has not happened. Nothing that he has said has been proven predictive before. It's always been something happens. Now let's go look at Nostradamus and find where he predicted it, right? And so you can see how when you look at these things, they're significantly murky to be able to impose the details you need to make them predict what you're looking to predict. Does that make sense? And that's the second piece right here that is very similar to Revelation. What Revelation and Nostradamus share is that Revelation has never been shown beforehand to predict an event happening in the future. Right? There's a whole method of understanding the book of Revelation that shows how all of the prophecies were fulfilled by AD 70, right, at the fall of the temple in Jerusalem. Right? And so there's one way of looking at the book of Revelation where they can show you how each one of these characters and each one of these things in the story predicted all these world events that happened before AD 70. But that was not at all a method of understanding Revelation anywhere before those events actually happened. Right? That happened hundreds and hundreds of years later that people were able to find the book of Revelation and say, okay, look, this is how it fits up, kind of like people do with Nostradamus, right? But the really popular way to look at the book of Revelation is something called dispensationalism. And that's kind of all of the, if you've seen any movies about the book of Revelation, or if you've read that like 28-volume fictional work on the book of Revelation, I don't know how long it is, it's really long. If you've read any of that, that's all talking about this kind of dispensational understanding of Revelation, which basically says it's all about predicting like in the future from now, like after now, right? And so there's really interesting things that people can do with the text. But again, we have the same problem, right, as Nostradamus, where it's not, that's in the future, right? So maybe one day those things will happen and we can say, yes, okay, that happened with Revelation. It was able to predict those events happening. But it hasn't happened yet. Good, which I'm glad for, because the stuff it predicts I'm not really excited about, right? But there are differences. So that's what they kind of share in common. But the real difference in the book of Revelation is in its composition, right? So the book of Revelation has complete sentences. It has correct grammar, right? It has a story that you can read. There's really nothing fundamentally unclear about its use of language. I mean, every biblical book has a little thing here or there, but it's nothing like in the book of Nostradamus' Quatrains, where almost every line has serious language issues that you've got to work out when you're translating. And so there's this whole way of reading the book of Revelation where you can open the book of Revelation and you can read it for yourself as a story, as like an instructive epic, right? That talks about the battle between good and evil that we all experience, right? And you can sit down with the book of Revelation, and as weird as it is, the dragon and the prophet and the whole thing, you can read it and understand it and get a message. And there is a clear message to the book of Revelation. There's a unified message about it, which is different from Nostradamus' prophecies. The unified message of Revelation, when you look at it as that kind of epic, this kind of instructive epic, is that those people who follow after God, right? Those people who do what God asks them to do, they will win in the end. When it all comes down, the people who have followed after God will be victorious, and those people, and will get to spend eternity connecting with God, and that those people who follow after God, or who did not follow after God, will spend the rest of their existence not connected with God, disconnected with God. So some of you may say, well, disconnected how? How long? Well, come on November 4th, because November 4th, the topic is God is love, so why hell, right? And so we're going to talk about the 3 or 4 different ways that people can understand the doctrine of hell, and hopefully answer the question, how can a loving God sentence people to eternal punishment for non-eternal acts of sin, right? And so, but the idea, the clear message of Revelation is that, right? That those people who follow God in the end will spend their life with God, and in the end, those who don't will be separated from God. And then the other thing is it gives specific warnings. Really, really specific warnings. So there's a passage in the book of Revelation, in Revelation chapters 13 and 14. Really specifically, the part I'm talking about is in 14 verses 9 through 11, where it talks about the mark of the beast. Right? And so the mark of the beast is something that in the book of Revelation it says that the Antichrist will require people to receive a mark on their forearm or their forehead, and that's the way that we will buy and sell and trade, right? And so you won't be able to buy something without this mark of the beast. So it's kind of you can think of it as like a credit card in your hand that you can kind of swipe and buy something, right? But they're not going to take cash anymore. That's the only method of payment. Now in the book of Revelation it says this: anyone who receives the mark of the beast will not inherit the kingdom. That's really specific, right? When this moment comes and somebody says, put this in your hand or your head, and if you don't do it, you're not going to be able to buy bread. When somebody comes to you and says that, don't do it, right? Because I'll be honest, like, I lose my wallet, and I don't lose my hand, right? And so the idea sounds pretty good to me on the surface. You know what I'm saying? And so I'm really glad that that's in there. But it is important, though, because it gives very specific instructions, which is very different than Nostradamus. Okay, so that's one of the ways that it's different. So here's the big question. Why? So what? Like, we're here today. That's interesting, right? But what does that mean for you today? Well, I think one of the things is that it's very clear. Our life, this world, has this process to it. Things begin and they end. We're born and we die. A plant is planted, it sprouts, it grows into a beautiful oak tree, and then a hurricane comes, right? Even stars a star will one day burn up all its fuel and die. Like, everything has that. And so what Nostradamus, the book of Revelation, all of this apocalyptic work that has happened from as soon as we were able to think, it tells one story. There will be an end. Just like everything else has its end, there will be an end to the world. The other thing that they all kind of share in common is that there's no real individual that controls the whole thing. Right? It's not like you get the book of Revelation and now you can unlock the whole deal and you can stop it from happening. Right? That's another kind of common message of these, is that though we have choices to make, those events, we can't stop them from happening on our own. Right? And so what that says to us, though, is that instead of trying to stop those events, we need to look at ourselves. And see, that's the message of Jesus, right? Over and over again. It's don't look outside of you. Don't look outside of you. Look inside of you, right? And so the message, I think, that Nostradamus and the book of Revelation share, and the message to us right now, is the end will come. Who do you want to be when it gets here? You will spend your life on whatever you want to spend your life on. You can spend your money, your time, your resources, your energy, all of your years on something. And one day the end will come for you. It may not be the end of the world, but one day the end will come. Who do you want to be? What do you want to have spent your life on? And so that's what I want us to think about the rest of this week, before we come back next week. What am I spending my life on? And is it what I want to spend my life on? And if not, well, we can change that. We may not be able to change whether or not the Antichrist rises to power, or whether or not horrible terrorist acts happen. We may not be able to change that, but we can change what we do with our life. Would you mind praying with me? God, thank you for giving us free will. Free will to choose what we would do with our life. Thank you that you give us things that are fascinating, mysterious, and utterly interesting, like prophecy and apocalyptic literature. Thank you that you don't sentence us to some sort of blah life where there's nothing outside of our comfort zone. God, I pray for us this week. Would you help us to look at ourselves with confidence that someday the end will come? Would you help us to do what it takes to change our life so that when the end does come, we will be the person we want to be when it gets here. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Now, before Courtney comes and leads us in one song, wait, let me make sure. Yes. Before Courtney comes and leads us in one more song, I just wanted to give you a preview of next week. So it turns out we've got in our Bible 4 Gospels. The gospel, the word gospel really means a story about Jesus' life, right? And so there's 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But it turns out that there are way more stories, old stories about the life of Jesus that have been discovered by archaeologists, right? And so the question that should be asked by you, and has definitely been asked by the History Channel many times, is, what do those Gospels say? And why aren't they in our Bible? We'll have that answer next week. So come on back. We'll have more chairs too.